This morning's scripture reading is Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not be in want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. He guides me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Good to see everyone here this morning. It's especially good to see all of our travelers back here with us. We've had a number of folks traveling hither, thither, and yon. I was going to tease Doyle and Winnie for having missed last week. Glad that they were back with us this morning. Come to find out, they were visiting with Winnie's mother, who was celebrating her birthday. And so I thought, well, okay, how many years is that? She said 113.
Oh my wow.
So, Winnie, that is awesome. And so they have been granted officially a excused absence. Excused absence. They are definitely a reason to be absent from us last week. Well, last week we started a series of lessons that I have entitled The Churches of Christ. Who are these people? And what I want to focus on mostly is a return to first principles. This is not going to be a series of lectures on the American Restoration Movement. I could easily end up there, that perhaps next to Scripture is my first love. You might say it's my second love. So it could very easily degenerate into that. But really what I want us to do is to look at first principles. What makes us who we are as disciples of Christ? I wanted to do this for a number of reasons. Number one, it helps to build our faith. But number two, it helps us to perhaps be able to share our faith, to give us a little bit of grounding, to help us understand a little bit about our faith and to realize perhaps where other people stand, so that when we are confronted with a question, well, what do you believe? What do you think about this or that? You might be able to have a little bit better answer. There is, by way of a very convoluted introduction this morning, there is a fundamental requirement, I believe, for becoming an adult. And that is the ability to accept both of the positive and the negative aspects of our past. And that can be our own immediate family. It could be our extended family. I don't know about you. I have more than one skeleton in my closet. I come from a long history of rather interesting and unique people. Luckily for Kylie, that weird part ends right here. I'm not going to pass any of those genes on. I had an uncle, I believe perhaps a great uncle, kept missing appointments because he would oversleep. So he decided to buy him one of those old, those old wind-up alarm clocks. Ring, 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 ring. When they went off, it sounded like, the apocalypse. And well, the ticking kept him up all night, wouldn't let him sleep, so he put the alarm clock in his refrigerator. This is my heritage. Okay? But there's really two kinds of immaturity, somewhat related, you might say. One is the toddler. The toddler believes that absolutely nothing in my family is wrong. My dad's the greatest. My mom's best cook. Oh, my family is the greatest. My family is the most wonderful. And when you're a toddler, that's how you view your life. I mean, mom and dad are the greatest. Even brothers and sisters are awesome. But then the other type of immaturity is the teenager. And somewhere between toddlerhood and teenagerhood, everything reverses. My dad is dumb as a brick. And my mom can't do anything right. And I have got the worst set of brothers and sisters that were ever given to anybody in the entire history of mankind. It's amazing that I turned out to be so perfect. Well, the problem is that there are a lot of 30-year-old and 40-year-old and 50-year-old and 60-year-old, and you might even say 70 or 80-year-old toddlers and teenagers. They are not emotionally capable of accepting the fact that, yes, their history contains some bumps and some skeletons. But that doesn't make their history bad or wrong. That there are both good and bad in every family. There are good and bad in all people. There are good and bad in every history. Secular history, religious history, it doesn't matter. So why is maturity so critical in examining our history? Well, if we can't look back and judge both the positive and the negative, the rights and the wrongs of our ancestors, we'll never be able to rise above them or to move past where they failed. So one of my goals in bringing this series of lessons is to highlight the positive aspects of our history so that we can build on them, but also to address some of what I consider to be some of the weaknesses, some of the mistakes that were made throughout our history, so that we can either correct them or at least acknowledge them and overcome them. Last week we started with a statement that the Restoration Movement was, among many other things, a return to first principles. By and large, what I'm talking about is that movement that began in the early 1800s, and I actually said that last week I said that we are celebrating basically our 200-year anniversary. Actually, I was off by about 20 years. Many of the writings of the early Restoration movement started in the late 1700s and actually the first decade of the 1800s. So we're actually around the 220th anniversary of some of these earliest writings. And I believe that the return to first principles is one of our positive aspects of our history. Last week I referred to the brilliance of men like Barton Stone, Alexander Campbell, Walter Scott, a fellow by the name of Moses Lard. How can you go wrong with a name like Moses Lard? Many, many others. But I think in one aspect, I think they made a mistake in the principle of returning to first principles. I don't think it was carried out quite far enough. It's not that they went back too far. I think that they didn't go back far enough. For those men, Stone and Campbell and Scott and Moses Lard and others, what they wanted to do, they were focusing on the church. And so for them, they just needed to go back to the New Testament, to the founding of the church. And that was all that was necessary. And to their credit, looking at the positive here again, they may have been right for their generation. But what they did was they left us a legacy. All of their followers, all of their spiritual heirs, that we only have to start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and primarily even the book of Acts. And we just need to start there. And once again, for their generation, that might have been true. But we don't live in the late 1700s, 1780s, 1790s, early 1800s. We live in the year 2024. And something profound happened in the mid 1800s that profoundly changed their culture from our culture, specifically as it relates to religious things in the church. And that is one man, Charles Darwin, who was born in 1809, just as Stone and Campbell and all these others were getting started. Another man came on the scene, was born into this world by the name of Charles Darwin. And in 1859, he published the book, and it's either The Origin of Species or On the Origin of Species. And that changed the way the intelligentsia, the educated people, viewed God. And that book has so changed our culture that we don't really need to start by going back to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Acts, and Romans. We need to go back even further. The simple fact is that us today in 2024, we don't have the same view of God that the hearers or the readers of Stone and Campbell did in the early 1800s. And for that reason alone, our quest to go back to first principles encourages us to go back further than they did. And so our quest is a return to the first principle. So that is what we are looking at this morning. If you grew up, as I did, listening to The Twilight Zone, Rod Serling, he always began each episode with, imagine, if you will, or picture, if you will. Well, I want us this morning to imagine, if you will, a man who has been given the task of writing the history of the world. Now, I'm going to assume that man was Moses, and that he is the author of at least most of the books that we know of as Genesis through Deuteronomy. And that raises a bunch of questions. For example, when did he write it? Well, it could be slightly before Mount Sinai. It could have been shortly after Mount Sinai. Could have been while he was in the wilderness, while God was preparing him to lead the people out of Egypt. Certainly, the stories that comprise the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy existed for centuries, generations. Fathers would tell the story of perhaps even the creation, but certainly Noah and the flood, Abraham and Isaac, and even Jacob as it got real close to their own history. So the stories would have been circulating, the stories would have been told for generations. But he was tasked to write it down. And so the next question then would be, for what purpose? Why did God give him this task? Well, once again, many different answers, but I believe that Moses was writing this down as a permanent record for what God wanted his people to know how the world was created and why the world was created, both to correct false teachings, but also to teach, to instruct a nation. You stop and think about it. Up until this point, the Israelites were kind of a loose amalgamation, a loose confederation of families and clans and tribes. And so families could gather, and the patriarch of the family could tell these stories, but they might only tell one part of the story. And somewhere over here might be another clan or another family or perhaps even another tribe. And the patriarch of that group would tell perhaps even the same story, but it might focus on a different individual or have different details. And so God says, I want a record of what I want my people to know for all the rest of history, of not only what I did, but how I did it and why I did it. So it's part correction, part instruction, part protection. So what was the basic culture in which Moses sat down to write this history? Well, it was very religious. You go back and you read any accounts of what it would have been like during this time. Every culture was profoundly religious. Every culture had not only maybe their main god, but a whole bunch of gods. It was certainly true of Egypt, where the people were coming out of, and also very true about the land that they were going to be inhabiting, the land of Canaan. And most of these cultures were polytheistic, many gods, not just one, but many gods. And you might even say competing gods. So let's go back and look very, very quickly at a summary of Genesis 1:1 through chapter 2 and verse 3. And there's an outline there in the bulletin in front of you, just a couple of points that I wanted to draw out about this introduction to this history that I believe Moses had a large part in writing, if not wrote the entire thing. So Moses begins with those famous words, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So when did this happen? In the beginning. We're not told how long. We're just told when everything started. And in fact, your translation, depending on the newness of your translation, might even use the word when there. When God was beginning, he created. Who was it that did the creating? It's God. Not the gods. Not one of the gods. Not the God of creation, but God. Elohim. What did he do? He created out of nothing. There was nothingness, and then there was something. What did he create? Well, he created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Now, your specific translation may have a number of different variations there. That is typically the way most translations are going to read, but you might have a different variation here or there. So then we go on throughout the rest of the chapter, and God explains to us the sequence. Moses, writing for God, explains to us the sequence of what happens. But I want to point out the symmetry of what this chapter teaches us about the creation. On day one, we have obviously the creation of heavens and the earth. But specifically on day one, we have the creation of light, verses 3 to 5. Now, it's not until day 4, verses 14 through 19, that we have the creation of the sun, the moon, and the stars. So the question arises, especially if you're 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, you're trying to read this and you're trying to understand this for the first time. How could there be light if the sun hasn't even been created? Well, the answer to that is God doesn't need a sun to have light. In fact, we're told in the book of Revelation, chapter 22, the last chapter of the Bible, that in the new world, in the new creation, God himself will be the light. So that doesn't bother me that on day one, light was created and the sun, the moon, and the stars were not created until day 4. But there's a very specific reason that it's told that way. Come to that in just a moment. On day 2, we have the separation of the heavens and the seas. And depending on your translation, it might be separation of the firmament. I always wondered what a firmament was. It's the separation of the heavens and the seas, the waters above and the waters below. Well, then we jump ahead to day 5, and we see that God puts something to live in the firmament above and the firmament below. So on day 2, verses 6 to 8, there's the separation. On day 5, we have the inhabitants. Somebody's going to live there. Well, some things, actually. So the birds are given the sky, and the fish are given the waters. It's kind of like the sun, the moon, and the stars are given a place to live. It's called light. So God creates light, and then he puts something to live in that light, the sun, the moon, and the stars. Day 2, we have the separation of the firmament above and below. Day 5, we have something to live there. Day 3, verses 9 through 13, we have dry land appearing. But not only dry land, but we also have vegetation, beginning with grass and then moving up what we would consider to be the complexity chain to seed-bearing trees. And then on day 6, verses 24 to 31, we have something to live on dry land. We have all the wee beasties and the reptiles and the black-wooded spiders, which I have no idea why God created except to give me the heebie-jeebies. I don't know. But we have all of the land animals. And finally, at the very end, on day 6, we have the creation of man. Another very interesting little highlight here, and I don't know if we need to make this big of a deal out of it, but it was fascinating for me to look at, is on days 1, 2, and 3, the description of what happened is very short. God said, God did. God saw. God said, God did, God saw. On days 4, 5, and 6, the description gets longer. It's almost like God says, okay, I'm preparing a place, a realm for all of these beings to exist, but when I get to the beings that I'm going to put there, I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about what it is and what they're supposed to do. And so the sun, the moon, and the stars are not just created. And it's not that God saw and God recognized that it was good, but he put them there to rule, the sun to rule over the day, the moon to rule over the night. And the birds and the fish are given their place in the world, the sky and the sea, so that they can rule over the air and the sea. That is their domain. And then finally, on dry land and vegetation, we have the land animals. We've got all of the cattle and even the creepy crawlies, the reptiles, and like I said, the insects and everything. And then finally, at the very end, we've got man. And what is man given? Man is given dominion. He is given the ability to rule over all the dry land, the vegetation, and the animals. The very pinnacle of God's creation is man, male and female, by the way. Not just male, but male and female. And so on day 7, God rests. Everything is done. It's perfect, it's perfected, and it is perfect. And God's judgment over all of creation is that it is very good. So 3 questions that I want to draw out of this very, very, very quick summation. Number 1, what does this tell us about God? Number 1, it tells us that God is creator. Now, this is going to be very different from the world in which the Egyptians or the Israelites are coming out of Egyptian bondage. It's also going to be very, very different from the culture to which they are going. The Egyptian religion and the Canaanite religion are profoundly different. And God says you're not to believe the gods from which you came. You're not to believe or to listen to the gods where I am sending you. I, Jehovah God, am the creator. This chapter talks to us about God's power and his ability to create, his transcendence, the fact that God is over everything. In fact, when we go back and we look at the Egyptian gods, very often, and throughout history, changed, but one of the primary Egyptian gods was that of the sun. They worshiped the sun. God says, don't do that. I created the sun. But I didn't do that until the 4th day. I didn't even create the sun as the very, very first thing that I created, as the matter of importance that you might want to worship. It was way down the list of important things. Don't be worshiping that sun. Don't be worshiping that moon. And when you come over here into the land of Canaan, you're going to be worshiping all these gods of the fertility cults. Don't do that. I created vegetation. There's no God of vegetation. There's no God of reproduction. I, Jehovah God, Yahweh, I created all of these things. It talks about the transcendence of God. But secondly, this teaches us about the immanence, I-M-M-A-N-E-N-C-E, the immanence of God. God designed this with incredible skill and plan, and there's an intent involved here. But beyond all of that, there is an interaction between God and his creation. It wasn't an accident. It didn't just happen, like Charles Darwin is so famously accused of saying. Now, I haven't read On the Origin of Species, so I don't know exactly what Darwin says. I know how he is interpreted today is that we're all just an accident of biology. No. God says, I want you to know that I planned this with incredible skill and intent. But there's an interaction between me and my creation. I saw something that needed to happen. And so I spoke it into existence. I created it with my hands, my fingers. And then I actually gave my blessing that what I created was good. And at the very end of everything, I said, it's very good. And the very pinnacle of my creation, what I call human, I have given dominion over all the rest of my creation. So what does this tell us about us? If that's what Genesis 1 teaches about God, what does this teach about us? We are the ultimate creation. We have been given authority. We have been given dominion over all of God's creation. Now, I will let you know that this is also the subject of an entire future lesson. We're going to spend at least 1 week looking at who we are as mankind in God's eyes. So we are the ultimate creation. We are not, however, the creator. There is a vast separation between us and God. We exist because God created us, and we have been given dominion because God has given it to us. But the other thing I wanted to point out here is that we are created in the image of God. Now, this is profoundly different. It's 180 degrees different from what the Israelites would have heard in Egypt and what they will be told in Canaan. Because both in Egypt and in Canaan, the gods were created in the image of man. God says, no, I created you in my image. And if we ever reverse that, we ever get that upside down or backwards, everything falls apart. The third question I would like to ask and answer is, what does this teach us about how we respond to God? And there's a whole bunch of isms here. But we honor God by praising him for who he is and not who we want him to be. In Egypt and in Canaan and all the surrounding cultures, they lived under the realm of polytheism, many gods. And like I said earlier, even competing gods, warring gods. Another very similar idea would be pantheism. And that we even see some cultures today that are pantheistic. And in that thought, everything, or at least living things, are gods. And so in some cultures today, for instance, certain livestock cannot be killed because that animal is a god. There are a lot of different variations, but pantheism is everything, especially living things. You might not say that a rock is a god or a tree is a god, but a living animal, every living animal is a god. And then there is panentheism. Pan, and then E-N, T-H-E-I-S-M. And this is the idea that God is in everything. God is in the wind. God is in the rain. God is in that rainbow. God is in the sunshine. And all of these are wrong. God is not in that wind. God created the wind. He is separate from. It is a work of his hand. It was a work of his design. It was a work of his plan. But the wind is not God, and God is not even in the wind. God is not in the rain. The rain is a function of God's plan and God's design, what God created the world, how God created the world to work. But we don't collect rainwater and say, "Look, I've got a glass of God. Ain't that wonderful?" We can't do that. Finally, we have humanism, which is a direct result of Charles Darwin, that we are God. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. I'm my own God. You're your own God. You make your rules. You do you. I'll do me. And everybody will be happy. And then the last obvious, the worst ism is atheism. And there's probably another 2 or 3 isms that we could talk about as well. But by adding to what God has said, or by taking away from what God has said in Scripture, we deny and we destroy God's nature. And therefore, we become enemies of God. The bottom line is, unless we go back and understand and come to accept who God is and what he did for us, nothing else is going to matter. The first principle has got to be our understanding of who God is and what our relationship to God is. The next couple of Sundays, we're going to break that down just a little bit further. We're going to look at a couple of other characteristics of God. This morning, we looked at God as creator and what that means for us, what that means for his church. Because if God created mankind to be the very pinnacle of his creation, and God sent his son to die for us because of our rebellion against him and all these isms that we talked about. If God did that for us, and if God gave us his church, shouldn't we love and respect and honor that church? Is this church not something that we should take seriously and try to make this church as close to what God wants it to be as we humanly can? God is our creator. Let us bear that in mind this week as we stop to think about what it means to be a disciple of Christ. If there is anyone this morning that desires to make a response to the church as your spiritual family, to God, could we put our arms around you and pray for you? If there is any way that we need to respond or with you to help you, would you let us know as we stand and sing?